It's homebrew time again, this time making my second single malt and single hop Maris Otter Cascade SMaSH Pale Ale. And I'm going to use this starter. This is cooling down in a nice cold water bath. It should be about right. It is going to be about 2 liters. Right now it's a little bit less than 1900 milliliters. That's because I'm going to be adding about 100, it's a little more than 100 milliliters of harvested yeast. You may recognize this if you've seen my previous video when I harvested the yeast. It's because I just continued straight on into making my starter. So I will be adding my harvested yeast. This was soaked in Star San. And there's our funnel. Just showed up. Now these are the ingredients that I'll use for the next 6 Maris Otter Cascade single malt and single hop pale ales. As you can see, I've got some rather unconventional yeast. This is yeast that I harvested from the first Maris Otter Cascade pale ale. And I used a Nottingham yeast. And this is all the yeast that I managed to get. I think it's fairly close to pure yeast and not any of the trub. However, it doesn't look like very much. So, a lot of people, when they make a starter, they make a 1-liter starter. I've just decided to make 2-liter starters. This is the one I'll be using today. And hopefully with a 2-liter starter, I will get enough yeast to brew a batch properly. Now, the previous time I used Muntons, if you've seen my previous video, and Muntons is only, it says on the side of it that it's guaranteed at least 67% Maris Otter. Well, I want 100% Maris Otter. So I went to Northern Brewer and purchased their Maillard malts, Maris Otter, which is 6 pounds. Now, my previous Maris Otter, by the way, I adore that beer. It is really freaking good. That's kind of a problem because I drink it really fast. I drink a lot of it. But I made it with 6.6 pounds of liquid malt extract, which was at least 2/3 Maris Otter. So this time I'm going to have to use less liquid malt extract and more of the one ingredient that isn't up there yet, some dextrose. And it actually could use some drying out. It's a little bit thick, a little sticky, so I'm happy to be drying it out. Half of one of these per batch, 4 ounces apiece. Be dividing those 4 ounces up into different boil times for whether I'm going for aroma or bitterness or flavor, whatever. But right now, back behind me, I've got the boil going, got my timer going. It's counting down 38 minutes. That's because I put the initial hops in there for, that's 2 ounces that are going to be in there for 60 minutes because I want this to be much more bitter than this. I can hardly taste any bitterness in this at all. And like I said, it only had 1 ounce in for 60 minutes. And then for 22 minutes, I'm going to put in 1 ounce of Cascade. And for 8 minutes, I'm going to put in 1 ounce of Cascade. And that should be, according to this chart, that should be getting the maximum bitterness, the maximum flavor, and the maximum aroma. We'll see. While we're at it, let's take a look at this awesome, awesome, awesome shirt from the back. Now, because I am worried about having enough yeast, considering that I harvested yeast from that first Maris Otter brew, and I don't know how much I got in those little bottles, I'm going to be using everything in this jar. Sometimes people pour the beer off the top, but obviously you're going to lose some yeast when you do that because there's always going to be some left in suspension. I don't want to lose any. So this has been in the fridge for, I don't know, a week, a few days anyway, and it's out getting warmed up. And I've got it, I just put it on this stir plate to get it going. This is the stuff that was at the bottom, the trub and the yeast and all that stuff. And now I've got it stirring up, and hopefully by the time it's ready to pitch, it'll be much more homogeneous. Now this is very interesting to me. The color of the boil of the wort has changed. It's become much darker. Now why would that be? I'm thinking it's from the hops, because they make it into a sort of tea, and of course these are really green, and so maybe they've turned it into a green tea. The other possibility is that maybe there's some cooking going on of the wort. And I kind of hope that's not the case. That just seems a little weird to me. Alright, it's been about 55 minutes. And 5 minutes ago, there were still a lot of big chunks going around in there, and I was wondering if it was going to be homogenized in time. But look at that. I now have an empty pot. That's because I used my handy-dandy wort chiller, which at this time of year, it's January, and into February it'll get even more colder because there's a delay in the colder temperatures underground where the water is. It took, I don't know, a minute and a half, and boy, you can rocket right past your desired temperature. So it's, you know, these things are kind of tricky. But I got it to the right temperature really fast. This is maybe the fastest beer I've ever made. Now this makes me wish that I had tasted the yeast starter before I poured it in, just to see if there was anything strange about it. Look how fast this is fermenting. Now what's interesting about this is that I only pitched the yeast about 4 hours ago, and yet it's already going. If it took 2 days to get started, that wouldn't have concerned me. If it took 1 day to get started, I'd think, that's about right, that's pretty good. But 4 hours to suddenly be going like this? Wow. Okay, this is unusual. I've never seen this before. And of course, the only difference between this batch of beer and every other batch of beer that I have ever made is that I made this with yeast that I harvested. What would cause this? I don't know. But what, of course, I'm talking about is that the yeast does not form a nice layer at the bottom of the fermenter. Instead, it's just all in weird cloudy clumps, like clouds floating around in atmosphere if you look down from the top. And that's pretty weird. How do you siphon this? I don't know. This is a little strange. What the heck? Let's share just a little bit about how I prevent my wort or my beer from getting oxygenated. By the way, I put this racking cane, whatever it's called, down into the bottom where it immediately started sucking that stuff up. So I've got some of that in my keg now. I'm not too happy about that. I don't like this. I might have to not use my my yeast anymore. I've read somewhere that it had something to do with the Whirlflock tablet, but I use Whirlflock tablets all the time, and I maybe get 1 or 2 little small clumps on the top. Never anything like this. Nothing like that at the bottom really either. So anyway, you might be able to hear, maybe not, but you can see some bubbles coming up there. That's because on my out connector, I have this CO2 tank. And what I first do is I sort of try to blast all of the oxygen, or all of the atmosphere, out of the container so that it's got pretty much mostly just CO2 in there. And then I leave it bubbling just a little bit as I'm filling the keg. That way there's always a pressure, not just from the beer rising in the keg, but also from the CO2 bubbling up to keep any atmosphere from getting into the keg. Alright, time for me to try Maris Otter number 2. I'm kind of surprised to see this carbonation when, let's see, I'd hooked it up for the first day and then discovered that I had turned the carbonation off. So although I put an initial 34 or 30 pounds of pressure on it, it hadn't remained with that. It had just absorbed all of that CO2 in over the next 24 hours and wasn't getting any more out of the tank. But this is looking pretty good for just 12 hours worth. Tastes a little bitter judging by the foam. It is definitely not as sweet as the first Maris Otter, or I should call it the 0th Maris Otter, because it's going to be a little different from all these others. The first one was, well, the 0th one. It's kind of lacking the sweet taste of the previous Maris Otter, because this one has dextrose. And the other one was all dry malt extract and liquid malt extract. No, it was all liquid malt extract. And this one's got some dextrose in it, which dried it out a little bit. It's definitely more bitter. Not catching much in the way of aroma. Yeah, I think the bitterness sort of overwhelms the flavor. Maybe I'll have another opinion as the keg gets a little lower and I see that it's kind of cloudy. I don't think you can tell. But I don't know, maybe it's just the first one because of that weird stuff that made it into the keg that was floating around in there. But we'll see how it progresses. Maris Otter number 2, Maris Otter Cascade SMaSH.